If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton. I'm an author and a public historian, and today I'm going to be talking about the legend that is Robin Hood. I absolutely love Robin Hood. I've watched all the TV shows, I've watched all the films, absolutely love him. Robin Hood and King Arthur are the reasons I got interested in history, I think when I was about 4. And I still feel kind of very sentimental about Robin Hood because I had these amazing Ladybird books about his adventures, where he fights, Guy of Gisborne, etc. And I just found them in a stash of things that my mother gave me. There's something about those stories that you don't see anywhere else, fighting with staffs over streams. I can see myself doing that. Though I have to say, I fear now that if I was cast by an agency, I think they'd see me more Friar Tuck-like looking than Little John or Robin Hood. The pleasures of aging. Though that being said, I do think that Friar Tuck is a smart fellow, and I would happily play him. So Kevin Costner, who apparently was meant to speak English with an English accent in his Robin Hood movie, and, when the director heard his accent, he just said, no way. And Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, is actually regarded as the worst Robin Hood movie ever made, but also the best one. It's considered the worst one because it was just completely inconceivable. In one part at the beginning of the movie, he actually walks all the way from Dover, which is down on the south coast, to Northumberland in just one day. That's 410 miles, guys. Via Hadrian's Wall, I might add, which is even further north. Russell Crowe's Robin Hood is the worst Robin Hood that I've ever seen. And really funnily, he actually walked out of an interview with the BBC when they challenged his accent. The interviewer was a guy called Mark Lawson, who's quite a good interviewer. And he said, so there's a little bit of Irish there, and there's a little bit of South Yorkshire too. And Russell Crowe was so outraged, he walked out. The reason for mentioning Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, right at the beginning is that in many ways it's canonical. I think because it reproduces all the elements of the legend that have been reproduced in children's stories and so on over the decades. And of course, you can't forget the Disney film as well, in which Robin Hood is a fox, literally a fox. And of course, all the references that we have to Robin Hood historically are in the old ballads that date back to the 14th century. And the first clear mention of Robin appears in the poem Piers Plowman, written by William Langland in the 1370s. In the poem, a character mentions knowing rhymes of Robin Hood. And the implication is that everyone is familiar with Robin Hood, that everybody knows Robin Hood already. And of course, then there's a later ballad that comes out, I think in about 1420, called Robin Hood and the Monk. And of course, everyone knows all the names, don't we? I mean, there's Robin Hood, there's Maid Marian, there's Friar Tuck, there's Little John, there's Will Scarlet, Much the Miller's Son, Alan a Dale, Guy of Gisborne, Prince John, boo. And of course, Sean Connery as Richard the Lionheart in the Kevin Costner film. Robin himself is a returning crusader, which is actually very interesting by itself. It's an interesting innovation in the story, as I will soon allude to you. So the elements of the story is that he robs from the rich and gives to the poor, and he rides through glens. And I'm laughing at that because there's a song coming up that I'll actually try and sing to you, or maybe not. Maybe I'll just play it to you. I'll see how brave I am, that mentions the glens, riding through glens. So I'll tell you a little bit about that later. But of course, Sherwood Forest plays heavily. The Sheriff of Nottingham, there's lots of archery contests. Oh, and of course, in later iterations, he's of noble birth. But in the old poems, in the old ballads, Robin is a yeoman. But in the Kevin Costner movie and similar versions, he's absolutely not a yeoman. He's nobly born, isn't he? So I thought it would be interesting to look at the oldest known ballads that mention Robin Hood and go through them and see what elements of it are being reproduced, in movies like The Prince of Thieves and all the other movies and TV and that kind of stuff. So I'll go through and tell you the plot of some of these ballads. They basically open with a description of the fair forest being very merry. So everything being merry is right there from the absolute beginning. Robin is walking through the forest with Little John. So Little John is there from the beginning. So is Much the miller's son. So elements that aren't there but come in later. That Robin has a deep devotion to the Virgin. He wants to go to Nottingham. He wants to attend Mass and pay his devotion to the Virgin. Kevin Costner didn't do that in the movie. And in the ballads, Robin is absolutely at this stage a yeoman. Little John and Robin Hood have a kind of a wager. Little John wins it. Robin refuses to pay. So Robin and Little John kind of go off differently. Robin in the old ballads goes to Nottingham. He goes to St. Mary's Church. He's kneeling before the cross, and an evil monk spots him there and rushes off to tell on him to the Sheriff of Nottingham. So the Sheriff of Nottingham is there from the beginning as well. Men at arms come rushing in, they capture Robin. So that's another absolute theme that carries through to the stories now, isn't it? And it's even in the Walt Disney film. So Little John and Much the miller's son have to rescue him, and they end up coming across this monk, and the monk has a servant, and he is heading off to see the king to say that Robin Hood has been captured. What happens next doesn't tend to feature, certainly in the children's books, because Little John then cuts off the monk's head, and I'm sure that children would absolutely love that, though, I think by and large. And then Much the miller's son cuts off the little page's head. And then they go off in disguise and they bring the news to the king. The King of England is also part of the story. So the King of England isn't on a crusade or languishing in prison at this particular point. They then trick the king into thinking that the monk is still alive. And so the king gives them a reward. And then they go to the Sheriff of Nottingham. And again, they trick the Sheriff of Nottingham into thinking that the monk is still alive and that they've come from the king. And keep in mind, this is all set in about 1420, and it's full of the ballad is actually full of tricks and scams and, and much merriness. So the Sheriff of Nottingham gives them a slap-up meal with the best wine in his cellar. So keep in mind, they're in disguise in the heart of the castle of Nottingham. And it's a classic tale, isn't it? This is the tale that we all know. And of course, then they free Robin. And there it is. The thing that is interesting in these early ballads, because there's a couple of these early ballads, the guest of Robin Hood, as in G-E-S-T, the guest of Robin Hood. In those stories, they're tricksters, but they're not necessarily enormously, they're not benevolent figures at all, are they? They're cutting pages' heads off, so they're definitely outlaws. There's no, getting away from that. And Guy of Gisborne, he's also there right from the beginning. So that's another early 15th century romance. And in that, Robin actually cuts off Guy's head, sticks the head on the end of his bow, and then mutilates his face with a knife. And so it's not just the ballads. There are also plays that are being performed in these early times. And there are early documents that are found from landowners in East Anglia, during the Wars of the Roses. And among the collection of papers, there's a very short 21-line or maybe 23-line, something like that, a very short play. And in that, Robin actually cuts off a head and he puts it in his hood. So there's a lot of beheading going on, in these early ballads and stories and plays. But people, they weren't squeamish about such things back then. So the guest of Robin Hood, that's probably the key one, because that's the one with loads of elements. There's archery contests and hostility to greedy clerics. So, that's also a running theme. the king actually goes into the forest and he's kidnapped by Robin and his merry men, and they give him food. And so, then it ends with Robin's death at the hands of his cousin, the prioress of Kirkley. And we might come to that a little bit later on, because that's a particularly fascinating aspect of the later story. So all those kind of elements are there. But I think the elements that are not there, they're particularly interesting at the point at which they come in. And I think that's fascinating. So the elements that are not there in these early tales are robbing from the rich to give to the poor. That's not an early element in any of the surviving medieval or Tudor tales. But do you know what I read about this? There's a historian called J.C. Holt. And interestingly, he was actually very keen about cricket. Anyway, he wrote a book about Robin Hood in the 1980s, and he suggests in one of the articles about Robin Hood that these plays that I've mentioned were put on by the ecclesiastical authorities in the 16th century. And they would have at the end, the people who played Robin and the other characters, they would have collection plates from the church. And it was really sort of impressed upon you that you had to give if you were watching these plays. There was a lot of pressure and all this sort of stuff about taking from the rich and giving to the poor. There's a sort of a hint that it was basically a massive con by the church to get the people to feel guilty to give money and make them give money to the church at the end of every single performance. So I think it's still with the grain of the story. So at the end of The Guest, it said that Robin did poor men much good. So it's not saying he's taking from the rich to give to the poor, but he is, he's kind of a friend of the poor. And he's also known as a friend of women. And there is this sense of chivalry there. And there's a story in which, in The Guest, there is a poor knight who is kind of down on his uppers, who's being kind of screwed out of his money by an evil band of monks in a monastery, and Robin comes to his rescue. So effectively, Robin is robbing from the rich to give to the distressed middle classes. That's effectively what that story tells us. That very same historian, J.C. Holt, I had a lot of questions saying, or asking, is Robin a proto-socialist? And he is actually a precursor, I think, to socialism or to, paternalistic Toryism. And I would say first the latter. I mean, obviously there's ridiculously sort of anachronistic concepts to be imposing on this, because I don't get a sense from these early ballads or the early plays, basically if they're being licensed by the church authorities and being used to drum up enthusiasm in collections. I don't get a sense that they're terribly subversive. But the question is, are they undermining the social order? Or are they just having fun? I mean, that they go out of their way, even though Robin and his mates are cutting pages' heads off. The ballads tell you that they're actually a very courteous kind of bunch. One says, a courteous man you will never find, or, kind of words to that effect. So they're not threatening, or are they? Well, there's a book that came out a couple of years ago called Story Worlds of Robin Hood by Leslie Coates, who is one of the great living experts on Robin Hood. And she has an excellent theory about where Robin Hood comes from. But I think we should save looking at that for the second half of the podcast, because I think in the second half, we should look at where these stories actually come from. Might there be a real Robin Hood? And if not, then where do the stories come from? And I know that you are hoping that I say there's a real Robin Hood. And I may well say that. So stick with me for the second half. Now, there's a couple of elements that we haven't gotten into. So the robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. Okay, so we've done that. What about Maid Marian? Maid Marian, I think I want to talk about her later in detail, because she's part of the May Day rituals that you get in the 16th century, which is not necessarily associated with Robin Hood. She's definitely French, though, or the implication is that she belongs to a different kind of series of stories that come from France. The Maid Marian that we get now in the films and the TV shows is basically a 19th century invention. So I think in the 17th century, Robin actually has a wife called Clorinda, which doesn't exactly trip off the tongue, does it? But that's actually another fascinating example of perhaps of the way that folk stories work in Britain, is that Robin is actually seen as a very upwardly mobile figure. So, we talked about how he starts as a yeoman and he ends as a member of the aristocracy, Robert of Locksley. And this seems to be an invention of a Tudor playwright called Anthony Munday, who in the 1590s actually writes two apparently not very good plays. Look, I haven't read them, so that's probably an unfair comment, but I've read lots about them. And one of them's called The Downfall of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon. I think the other one is The Death of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon. I'm pretty sure that's that. And of course, there's also a late 16th century biography which identifies him as coming from Locksley. And then he gets picked up by Sir Walter Scott at the beginning of the 19th century in Ivanhoe, which is probably the key fictional work that helps to generate the myth of Robin Hood. And so this idea that Robin is not actually a yeoman, but he is a dispossessed nobleman, that he is the Earl of Huntingdon or Locksley or whatever, it seems to be something that gradually evolves over the course of the centuries. But to go back to the point of where that comes in, so the late 16th century, so the myth or the legend, the stories that have been circulating, we know for at least 150 to 200 years, maybe longer, probably much longer actually. There doesn't seem to be an obvious kind of ideological subtext to making him an aristocrat at this particular moment in time. It's just a riff on the story, isn't it? I mean, there's no reason for somebody in Elizabethan England to think, we need an aristocratic hero rather than a yeoman, don't you think? And one of the things that is interesting about the ballads, the early medieval ones, is that there's no reason given why Robin is actually an outlaw in the first place. And in fact, one of the questions that I always had was, why was Robin an outlaw? We never get told in the early ballads that the first person to mention why Robin might be an outlaw is actually not English, but Scottish. So there's a whole series of weirdly Scottish historians in Scotland writing about Robin Hood in the 15th century. And these accounts are the first non-fiction reference to Robin Hood. They're actually referring to him as a historical figure. And one of them who's writing in the mid-15th century is a guy called Walter Bower. And he posits the idea that Robin had been fighting with Simon de Montfort against the armies of Henry III and Prince Edward, who goes on later to become Edward I or Edward Longshanks. And then you have the Battle of Evesham, in which Simon de Montfort is killed. And of course, we know the story. He's brutally gelded, his corpse is mutilated. And Walter Bower says, well, maybe Robin was fighting there and had to then flee into the woods after that battle to escape. And then that's followed up by another Scot writing at the beginning of the 16th century, a guy called John Major, who is the first to suggest that Robin had actually lived in the time of Richard I or Richard the Lionheart. And of course, remember in the Kevin Costner's film, we see Richard the Lionheart appearing at the end, and that's where they get that idea from. And John Major is the guy who actually casts him as being an overtly aristocratic figure. And I think that it's here that you get the germ of the idea that Robin has actually become an outlaw because he is facing evil times. But he is actually on the side of the king, because if you're trying to make Robin safe, you have to make him someone that decent people can identify with, don't you? You must give him a reason for being an outlaw that isn't to do with taking people's heads off and mutilating them with knives or, whatever. And so the idea that he is a nobleman who has been unjustly persecuted by evil Prince John, that's absolutely ideal because he's on the side of the king. But he also has a legitimate reason to be out in the greenwood, hiding out in Sherwood Forest. And that obviously comes later on, doesn't it? So all the 20th century, iterations or 19th century iterations of Robin Hood, he's a nice fellow. He's not a criminal. But these early mentions of Robin Hood, they're generally talking about someone who's perceived very much as a criminal. So these early ballads are in the long tradition of ballads that slightly celebrate, the kind of trickster figure, someone who's cleverly outwitting the authorities. And we love that. But there's no sense in those ballads that he's been unjustly accused. There's no explanation given for why he's in the forest. There's actually no explanation given at all. But maybe there's no need for an explanation, especially if they are familiar with the figure, and they seem to be. If he has a place in the folk memory already. So everybody knows that Robin Hood is merely an outlaw. And if they know, then they don't have to say why. And there is some suggestion that to be a Robin Hood in this sort of period, that this is actually a kind of a generic name that is given to people who are outlaws. You're just a Robin Hood. So instead of calling you an outlaw, they say, well, he's just a Robin Hood. So this is all part of the swirl of possible influences that might feed into the legend. And I think we should look at them in the second half. But looking at the way that the story evolves, from the 16th century onwards, I think it's clear that a sense of why Robin is in the forest has been lost, or there is a feeling that some explanation needs to be provided, don't you think, as to why he's there? And the one that goes with the grain of acceptable opinion is that he's on the side of the rightful king. He is a rebel against unjust oppression. He's probably of aristocratic background, and that's why the idea of him as someone in the reign of Richard the Lionheart with Bad Prince John as the regent, that's why it kind of suits perfectly, because it provides absolutely the kind of perfect context. So by the 17th century, Shakespeare actually mentions Robin Hood in As You Like It and Two Gentlemen of Verona as well, I think. But that's just a sort of reference to Robin in the Greenwood. They're passing references, aren't they? And of course, then Robin actually kind of goes very quiet in the 17th and 18th century. And it's only then at the end of the 18th century by a guy called Joseph Ritson, and he's actually a very interesting man by himself. He's very annoyed by the idea that Robin might be of an aristocratic background because Ritson is very much on the left. He's very much an enthusiast of the French Revolution. So Robin being an aristocrat doesn't sit very well with him. Interestingly about Ritson, and just as a sidebar, he was actually one of the very early kind of flirters with vegetarianism. He largely seemed, from what I can tell through the research, to eat muffin cakes and donuts. So I imagine he was a rather large man. Anyway, I digress. But he did eventually go mad, and he ended his days in an insane asylum. Anyway, he brings all the ballads about Robin together for the first time. He's the first guy who does that. And he has no illusion through the research that he's done that Robin is anything but real. He celebrates him as a subversive, as a radical, as someone who absolutely robs from the rich to give to the poor. And then the weird thing is that Sir Walter Scott, who isn't a subversive or a radical, he's basically Ritson's only friend. And Walter Scott actually gets some of his ideas for Ivanhoe from Ritson, from the Robin Hood story that Ritson actually writes. And Ritson assembles all these ballads, and it has a massive influence on quite a few of the poets and the novelists of the time. And Ivanhoe, as I just mentioned, in that book, there's the famous splitting of the arrow. The one, someone fires an arrow and it hits the bull, and then Robin actually steps forward and fires his arrow and it splits that arrow, in the middle of the bull. So that's a famous part of the myth that Ritson actually invents and creates. And Sir Walter Scott creates the myth of the rivalry between the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans. That rivalry isn't mentioned anywhere else in medieval history. So between the two of them, between Ritson and Sir Walter Scott, they create the figure that we now know as Robin Hood. I remember reading Ivanhoe when I was, I must have been 9 or 10. And I found the stuff about the Saxons and the Normans immensely persuasive. So I grew up thinking that the Normans hated the Saxons and vice versa, but it actually wasn't the case. It's also in the Robin Hood movie the first Robin Hood movie I ever saw starring Errol Flynn, and I think that was made in like 1938. And there was that famous line, do you remember it? He says, "It's not injustice that I hate, it's the Normans." And so Ritson and Scott create this myth, and of course it's then perpetrated, through millennia, and of course captured in films like that in 1938. And also in the Romantic period, or, the Walter Scott and Ritson's, kind of period of writing, there was another novel written where the other innovation, and it was written about Maid Marian by Thomas Love Peacock, who was a good friend of Percy Shelley, actually. And it's a very hard novel to read because there are lots of very in jokes about, kind of current politicians. And unless you're actually around during Shelley's time, most of the time you sit there reading it, wondering what the hell it's all about. However, he actually introduces the idea of the love triangle between Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham and Maid Marian. He's the guy who does that. And think of the amazing Alan Rickman and, Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio in the Kevin Costner movie. And, really interestingly, that film had to be re-edited, and the director was actually removed from the edit because Alan Rickman was too prominent. He was actually threatening Kevin Costner's ego. And if you go back, I urge you to go back and watch that movie. Alan Rickman in that movie is absolutely brilliant. He absolutely steals the show. He was an amazing actor. Anyway, I should stop talking about that movie and talk more about the history of Robin Hood. So it's at this stage that Maid Marian enters the story, basically by the early Victorian period. The other character I haven't massively talked about is Friar Tuck. And guess what? He is actually a real person. He's there from the very beginning, and it seems that he was a priest from Sussex around, I guess, probably about the 15th century. And he enters the story in 1475. And his real name is actually Robert Stafford. And he had actually gathered around him, if when you read back through the research in the ballads, especially in the J.C. Holt novel, a band of evildoers who committed murders and robberies and threatened the peace of Surrey and Sussex. Sounds like just the kind of religious man that you'd like to know. But he's very much a Surrey and Sussex man. And for those of you not familiar with English geography, that's down south. He's not a Yorkshireman or a Northerner. He's from the south of England. But he is someone who gets weaved into the story as Friar Tuck. So he must have been quite a malevolent figure at first, because he's a real-life criminal. But obviously, by the 20th century, Friar Tuck is actually a bit of comic relief, isn't he? He's not this malevolent figure that's murdering people. But also, of course, if he gets projected to the time of Richard the Lionheart, and this is the other foible, the mistake that they make in the films, is that there were no friars at this point. So it's something that's totally wrong historically in all the films and the TV shows. And that's basically because Richard the Lionheart was actually around in 1157, way before St. Francis, who actually didn't come about until 1226. So there were no friars. And I suppose this is a bit of a shameful moment. When I started this research, I didn't actually know the difference between a monk and a friar. I do now, though. So for those of you who, like me, didn't know, a friar is itinerant, and monks are generally in monasteries. So the friars, who are effectively itinerant and moving around, they become Robin's allies, and the monks, who are resident and greedy, become his enemies. So by the beginning of the 19th century, I think we've got all the elements in place for the story that we now know, or believe to be, Robin Hood. However, there is one more iteration. All these stories up to this point, they're never written for children. I mean, I think children would absolutely love them, especially because they have all this, incredible violence in them, but they're not written for children. And then there's an American writer who arguably, I would argue, is equally as important as Ritson and Scott in the transitioning of Robin Hood to America in cinema. And it's a guy called Howard Pyle, whose books have never been out of print. His version of Robin Hood, which were actually published in 1883 when he was 30 years old, he's an amazing guy. He actually did the illustrations himself. So he also interestingly created I mean, he was very influential. He was an incredibly influential illustrator because he's the guy who created the illustrations for pirate stories that established the first template for a pirate. And he does these amazing illustrations actually portraying Robin Hood in green with a feather in his hat. And he also invents the dialect, amazingly, that kind of faux medieval dialect. So, thou wilst and all that kind of stuff. So he's the one who also invents the enormous amount of merriness and of Robin and his gang going around, having fun romps in the forest and lots of fun. In his stories, no one ever has their head cut off, certainly not in the Howard Pyle versions. And guess what? Suddenly, Robin has a new audience. And these books are a tremendous success with children in the 1880s and the 1890s. And this actually explains then why Hollywood comes to it. Because without Pyle, Robin would not have resonance in the United States. And I think it's the Douglas Fairbanks version, which is the first ever film that's made of Robin Hood, may be made in about 1922. But the really interesting thing about that, I mean, I love Douglas Fairbanks as well, an incredible early actor. But his movie, that later inspires the Errol Flynn version. And get this, the Douglas Fairbanks version is the first film to actually have a Hollywood premiere. And I think both that and the Errol Flynn version, they were both enormously successful, very big budget movies. And, Robin Hood in those movies is a haute, intellectual kind of commercial property. And it makes him that in the earlier 20th century America. And then one final twist on that theme is that The Adventures of Robin Hood, which becomes a kind of massive TV series in Britain in the 1950s, it actually features incredible character actors like Sid James and Leslie Phillips and Jane Asher and Wilfred Bramble, from Steptoe and Son. I know if you're an American listener, you probably won't know these actors, but this is incredibly important because this early Robin Hood television series was chock-a-block full of British character actors, but the script for it was actually written by Americans who had fled from the US because they were victims of McCarthyism. And get this, there's at least one school district in America at the time that talked of banning stories with Robin Hood because they were seen as being too communistic, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor and all that kind of stuff. I mean, hard to believe, isn't it? But it's true. Now, there's a very famous song from that particular TV series that I'm going to attempt to sing to you. So if you don't want to hear the song, and I don't think that you need to, now would be a good time to go and make a cup of tea or have a toilet break. Here we go. This is how I remember it. Robin Hood, riding through the glen. Robin Hood, with his band of men. Feared by the bad, loved by the good. Robin Hood, Robin Hood, Robin Hood. It's one of those songs that just sticks with you. Anyway, I'm going to play the real one for you now so you can see what you think. And I think then, as we end on that note, when we come back, we should ask the question that you all have. Did Robin Hood really exist? And if he didn't, where does that story come from? I'll speak to you after the break. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia, My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we're back. So the legend of Robin Hood began with ballads and then went through various iterations. And essentially, it's a much more complicated story than the one that I've told you. There's so much more to it. So many more ballads and so many more folk stories and all this kind of stuff that I honestly didn't have the time to read or research. But I think I've done enough to come to you with an answer. So, did Robin Hood really exist? So, essentially, there are three answers to that question. And I know I can hear you groaning on the other side, but stay with me. The first is that he's entirely fictional and a product of ballads and literary traditions. Or there's a second one, that there's a real Robin Hood who actually existed. Or there's a third one, which is the theory that he was a very, very popular figure in the mid 20th century. And he's the expression of some kind of ancient pagan figure, the Green Man, or, something like that. And so that's the idea that's picked up on something that I didn't actually mention at all in the first half, which is in the 1980s TV series, Robin of Sherwood. And in that version, he's actually commissioned by Herne the Hunter to be a sort of champion for Deep England. And interestingly, that theory was actually pushed by a woman called Margaret Murray, who's an Egyptologist. And she had some terrible, terrible theories about witches and pagans. And she actually argued that Robin Hood is the image of the devil, that Robin Hood's hood is in some way associated with the horns of the devil. But all that is absolute complete rubbish. But actually, the person who originally comes up with the theory is a guy called Jacob Grimm. Everybody knows Grimm, right? From the Brothers Grimm, Grimm's fairy tales. He actually suggests that the name of Robin Hood comes from wooden. But I think that's also rubbish. Now, just to give you a bit of context, of the Brothers Grimm, wooden is actually depicted as a powerful and wise deity associated with war, wisdom, poetry, and death. And he's actually known for his one eye, having sacrificed the other for wisdom and for his ravens, who bring him information, from all over the world. The day Wednesday is actually named after him, just as another sidebar. And that actually stems from Wooden's day. But Grimm's, in Grimm's context, I think it's absolutely rubbish about Robin Hood. I don't believe it. So where that led me to is two possibilities. One, that there's actually a real Robin Hood, or two, that he's actually the product of literary traditions. And actually, while I'm thinking about this, there's a third one, isn't there? That he's a fusion of both of those. So he's not only real, but he's a product of those literary traditions. So as I mentioned, the earliest mention of Robin Hood is Robin Hood, as an outlaw who is the hero, of those first ballads, is in the poem Piers Plowman, which is a vast Middle English, kind of epic, which takes place in 1370. And in that, he's described, it's clear that his legends are, kind of very, very popular. And lots of people actually know him. That's clear when you read that poem. People obviously know who he is. And Langland, as I said, he's writing in the West Midlands, which is also kind of where Robin's supposed to be from. So that's kind of evidence that his stories are known in that part of England in the mid to 14th century. So presumably, you can, at the very least, push it back several generations, probably to the beginning of the 14th century. But how much further back than that can you go? And as I said, in the beginning of this podcast, there is evidence that the name Robin Hood is being used as a kind of generic name for outlaws. So there's an example of this from Berkshire in the 1260s. And again, that must imply that the origins of this are earlier. And of course, all the early references are to Robin being in either Sherwood Forest or Yorkshire. So this account, there is a man whose name is William. He was the son of somebody called Robert the Smith, and he was part of a gang. And there was a penalty imposed. His chattels were meant to have been seized. The entry in the King's Remembrances, or the Memoranda rolls, these are records that document the various administrative activities, judicial proceedings, and financial accounts and things like that at the time. Anyway, the King's Remembrancer, the guy who actually recorded this, wrote him down as William Robert Hood. But Robert Hood wasn't his name, but they were saying that that was the kind of person that he was. And of course, there is also a guy by the name of Robert Hod, who in the York Assizes of 1225 is described as futivitus, so Latin for outlaw. So that is another example of someone who's actually called Robert or Robin Hood, who appears, in the legal record, who is actually described as an outlaw. And of course, one of the things that's happened since the 19th century is that people have gone through all the medieval records, all the court rolls and assizes, and all kinds of stuff, looking for people called Robin Hood or Robert Hood. And a popular candidate is a guy called Robert Hood, who actually appears in the courtrooms of Wakefield in 1316. It's exciting, isn't it? So here's the thing. I know that Edward II is in the north of England around 1323. So kind of the same time zone. We're also told that in The Guest that the name of the king is Edward and not Richard. But we're kind of digging in for really kind of desperate stuff, really, aren't we? But there's also a man called Robert of Wetherby, who was actually captured in 1225. And his body was actually suspended in chains by the Sheriff of Yorkshire. It's sort of the right place-ish, isn't it? Kind of. And of course, there's also a guy called Robert Goodbird, who served under Simon de Montfort at Evesham, who becomes an outlaw. So these are all kinds of figures that were lurking around in these ballads and stories. But if truth be told, none of them kind of really fit, do they? But what you definitely do have is very ancient traditions of stories about outlaws, and these outlaws were very popular. There's another one. Hereward the Wake was an Anglo-Saxon nobleman and a leader of resistance against the Norman conquest of England. And he was actually called the Watchful of Sherwood Forest, or the Alert of Sherwood Forest. Again, another person that could be Robin Hood. So there is a tradition, and it's not just in England. There's lots of countries that have them, of the sort of bandit outlaw being the hero, the hero of the Commonwealth against the sort of the powerful. And the question is Robin Hood just a part of that? Is he just a part of that tradition? The trickster, the hero that everybody looks for. The idea of outlaws as heroes is there with Hereward the Wake. It's also there with another group of guys called the Falvilles, who are basically, delinquent members of the gentry who take to the woods. And Langland also mentions them, and they're actually essentially seen as being more honest than the law enforcement agents who are chasing after them. I mean, that's kind of keeping in the appeal, isn't it? And of course, then there is William Tell. Everybody knows William Tell in Switzerland. So there's lots of these examples of, outlaws across Europe who are very popular. And Robin Hood could quite easily fall into that category. I mean, I don't think there's a smoking gun among any of these candidates. I think there's just a sense of this being of kind of popular tradition that Robin Hood, for whatever reason, comes to be the generic name that's applied to the figure of outlaws. So that then begs the question of how and why, and when do these stories start to take the form that they do, and when do they start to be spoken and repeated and elaborated on? And I think the answer to that is focused on the fact that these stories are actually English. The tradition of these stories of people going out into the woods and people having adventures, this is actually a French courtly tradition. So the stories of King Arthur's knights, and all that kind of stuff. But not just King Arthur's knights. There are traditions of fableaux and all kinds of things that are French. So English is not a language at this stage which is being reproduced in court or anything like that. Everybody talks in French. So these are actually courtly stories. So the question is, when is the moment that that changes? And Leslie Coote has actually written a fantastic book that came out a couple of years ago. She actually suggests that the obvious moment is in the reign of Edward I, who's actually fighting the French at this stage. He doesn't have lands in France anymore, and he's fighting the Welsh. He's also fighting the Scottish. I mentioned him in Braveheart. And he wants to emphasize Englishness and the role of the English, and that he could speak English. And I think perhaps this is the point where the French traditions start to be translated into English. And perhaps this is the moment that Robin Hood is born. Leslie Coote also has a further fascinating thesis as to who Robin Hood might be. And this was kind of exciting. And in particular, why he's in the woods in the first place and who his true lord might be. and why he might be an outlaw. So earlier on, I talked about Maid Marian, and I was a little bit mysterious about where she might come from. And the reason why was because I wanted to talk about her in the latter part of this podcast. So what's another word for maid in the sense that it's used with Maid Marian? I know some of you are thinking out there. I know some of you already have the answer. I have to turn this back to Christianity. I'm sorry, but this is where this story is going. Maid Marian, and Coote agrees with this theory, is the Virgin Mary. So this again is a French tradition, and it's called pastorelle. And this is a tradition where there is a shepherdess called Marian, and she has a lover or a servant called Robin. It is absolutely clear that this is a kind of metaphor for the relationship of the individual Christian and his relationship to the Virgin Mary. That I have no doubt. The theory of Leslie Coote is that essentially this is the ultimate origin of the story of Robin Hood. And the reason that he is an outlaw is that his lord is the Virgin Mary. And the Virgin Mary in these stories is basically a kind of trickster. You know, Leslie Coote describes her in these popular tales as being tough, legalistic, sly, loud, practical, realistic, even apparently amoral and vengeful at times. And for Robin Hood, she serves as a very unruly, dangerous kind of female lord. And if you think of the story of Robin Hood and the monk, the very early ballad that I spoke of, first of all, the very earliest one, the whole plot revolves around Robin going into town to attend Mass, to pay his devotion to the Virgin Mary. And Leslie Coote says Robin Hood is neither a freedom fighter nor a social bandit. Robin is just a servant. It is his lord, the Virgin Mary, who is potentially dangerous in the socio-political sense. Mary is the lord of a great household whose seat lies in or lies near Sherwood Forest. So she's actually saying that Mary is the lord. And all the early stories make it clear that Robin Hood's devotion is to the Virgin. And the reason why they don't give a backstory for him, he is just in the greenwood because he's there as the servant of the Virgin Mary. That's her thesis. And of course, what makes this occluded is the Reformation, because with the Reformation, this goes out of the window. And essentially, the logic as to why Robin is in the greenwood, the reason why he is particularly devoted to the Virgin, that has to be erased. Robin's devotion to the Virgin is in all these stories. It's the kind of running theme, isn't it? And of course, we tend not to notice because, we just kind of see it as a medieval window dressing. It's in the background. I think it's kind of interesting that if you think about the role that Robin Hood plays in kind of the imagination, there's a deep vein of nostalgia there. He's in merry England, feasting on venison and effectively doing whatever he likes. And there is a sense, I think, in which Robin becomes the enemy of Protestant preachers. And one of the reasons why he starts to be phased out in the 16th and 17th century is because the association with the Virgin makes him awkward for Protestants to start to integrate into their ideas. And there's also this association of him with the end of May Day festivities. They're seen as kind of pagan and papist and that kind of thing. And that makes him really unpopular. And basically, over the course of the 16th century, he becomes out of fashion. And this is where he starts to become associated with the lower classes and the uneducated and with backwards men who don't have understanding. And then, brilliantly, he's reinvented at the end of the 16th century as a nobleman. And so then I wondered how that thesis of Leslie Coote's, how does that fit in with stuff about Edward I? How does that work? So there are these French stories of him and Marian being the Virgin Mary. I then wondered, why do they become so deep-rooted in the reign of Edward I when the English were fighting the French? And the conclusion I came to is that Edward I is actually encouraging the transliteration of these various genres and birth styles into English. So he's actually trying to anglicize what are very popular French tales. And so if they're in English, think about this, they can actually be repeated in pubs and taverns and alehouses. And so that by the late 14th century, people in pubs are actually familiar with them. I mentioned this familiarity. So when the stories first start, they're not being repeated in pubs because they're upmarket. So Edward has to anglicize them because they're in French. So the upper classes would have absolutely been familiar with them, but he needed the English public to be familiar with them. So here we go. The question that I think you've been waiting for me to answer, I think Robin Hood is actually fictional. Deep down, he's literary. He's a French literary construct. I think he's a literary construct who blends with a popular enthusiasm for outlaws. So I think he's kind of an Anglo-French invention, if you like. So all these questions that we've got from listeners, was he a Yorkshireman? Was he really a murderous brigand? Did he really live in Sherwood Forest? Look, I don't think they are beside the point questions, because I think that all these questions are kind of battening onto the fact that there is an inherent fascination about this particular figure. And the questions that are being asked tend to generate further traditions. Or do they? So one other book that I read in preparation for this podcast is absolutely brilliant example of this. I commend it to you. It's a book by Kai Roberts, who, judging by his, kind of Twitter photo, is very much not a Norman. He's kind of that jolly yeoman type figure. And his book is called Grave Concerns: The Following Folklore of Robin Hood's Final Resting Place. And this is focused on the idea of the story of Robin Hood's death, which doesn't tend to feature very often, I think, at all. Or maybe there's a Sean Connery version of it, of Robin Hood's actual death. So this is a version of the death of Robin Hood. And this particular narrative is actually based on one of the many ballads and legends surrounding, the famous English outlaw. And according to some versions of the legend, Robin Hood was betrayed and ultimately killed due to the treachery of a prioress of Kirklees, which is actually a real place, by the way, who was allegedly his cousin. And here's a more detailed account of the story. In the later years of his life, Robin Hood, feeling ill and very weak, sought medical help from his cousin, the prioress of Kirklees Nunnery. Trusting her, he hoped she would actually nurse him back to health. However, the prioress had a secret lover, Sir Roger of Doncaster, who was an enemy of Robin Hood, and together they conspire to kill him. So when Robin arrives at Kirklees, the prioress bled him. This is important. A common medical practice of the time believed to cure, various ailments. However, instead of performing the procedure correctly, she left the wound open to bleed excessively, intending to, effectively cause his death. Realizing he had betrayed, Robin Hood attempts to escape, but was far too weak to get very far. And then, according to legend, as he lay dying, he managed to blow his hunting horn to summon his loyal companion, Little John. And upon hearing the horn, Little John rushes to his master's aid. And although he found Robin too late to save him, he stayed by his side during his final moments. Now, this is the part of the story that I love. Some versions of the story also recount that, Robin Hood then shot an arrow from his deathbed and then instructed Little John to bury him where his arrow landed. And his grave at Kirklees Priory, near the ruins of the nunnery, is said to mark the spot where the legendary outlaw was laid to rest, because that's where the arrow landed. And the tale of his betrayal adds a tragic dimension, I think, to the Robin Hood legend, highlighting, themes of trust and loyalty and treachery, and all that kind of stuff that we really kind of dwell on, doesn't it? I mean, it really does. And of course, there is an ancient stone at Kirklees Park, and it's traditionally believed to mark the grave of Robin Hood. This site, known as Robin Hood's grave, is located actually within the grounds of Kirklees Hall in West Yorkshire in England. And the stone is actually inscribed, and it's been an enormous point of interest for many who are fascinated by the Robin Hood legend. The grave itself is actually said to date back to the 13th century, though it's never been, there's no authenticity of this site or of the exact origins of the stone. They actually remain huge subjects of debate among historians and Robin Hood, kind of enthusiasts. The stone bears an inscription, however, and it's now heavily weathered, which some claim to include the epitaph of Robin Hood. So the inscription, which has been interpreted and reinterpreted over many years, says this: "Here underneath this little stone lies Robert, Earl of Huntingdon. Ne'er archer was he so good, and people call him Robin Hood. Such outlaw as he and his men will England never see again." And it's dated 1247. So that inscription ties into the legend and absolutely romanticizes, the life and the death of Robin Hood, kind of in a way further cementing his place in English folklore. And the grave and the stone are surrounded by an aura of mystery and continue to draw visitors who are interested in the enduring legend of Robin Hood. However, this is kind of exciting. In the 1980s and 1990s, the stone that supposedly marks the grave of Robin Hood is actually in private land, and the estate is owned by the family that has owned it since about the 17th century, and it's not actually accessible to the public. And there was a pressure group that grew up in Yorkshire basically saying we should have access to it. As fans of Robin Hood, we should be allowed to go and visit the grave. And the owner of the estate through the centuries basically refused to let them go or let them get anywhere near it. And there was incredibly bad blood between them. And keep in mind, this isn't that long ago. And I use the word bad blood between them because in the end, there was a couple of them that ended up getting there. They ended up, kind of getting onto the land and finding, their president. I think it was actually the guy who did it. Someone who'd actually been involved in the 70s in a Highgate cemetery argument that took place, basically talking about Highgate Cemetery. And he basically argued in the 1970s, and keep in mind, this is also in the lure of all the Hammer House of horror films, that Highgate Cemetery was actually haunted by a vampire. And I know this is a long way to get to it, but I'm getting to it. And he was terribly interested in vampirism because in his understanding of the prioress bleeding Robin Hood, he came up with the thesis that the prioress was actually a vampire and had turned Robin Hood into a vampire, and that they were haunting the grounds of this estate that no one was allowed into. So they broke in and they went to the side of the grave and they saw the actual prioress. Can you believe it? And I will read a description of what he saw. A woman, her eyes dark mad, set in her pale face like a bat, a black nun's robes flapping eerily, while her eyes flashed red and venomous, her teeth sharpened white, between snarling blood-red lips. And this is what he reports seeing. So this was in the 1980s. So apparently the prioress is still out there. Presumably, that would mean that Robin Hood is out there as well, wouldn't it? I mean, if he's a vampire. So what I love about that story, and one of the reasons why I mentioned it, is this is a brilliant kind of example of the way in which these traditions, these ballads, these stories actually generate new traditions about Robin Hood. So have we solved the riddle of Robin Hood? I'll finish by saying, the question of whether Robin Hood is a real historical figure is a complex one, and it's been the subject of much debate among historians and folklorists, as you've seen, through this podcast. Robin Hood appears in various legal documents that I didn't mention to you, in literary documents, from the 13th and 14th century. And these references, they depict him as an outlaw, but they're sparse and they're sometimes contradictory. Several historical figures have been suggested as being the possible inspirations for Robin Hood, including guys that I've mentioned, like Robert Hod or Robert Hood of Yorkshire. An outlaw that was mentioned in the court records of the late 13th century. There was also Robert Godbeard, an active outlaw in the 13th century, whose activities and character actually bear some resemblance to the real Robin Hood of legend. And of course, there was Fulk Fitzwarren, a nobleman who rebelled against King John and whose life story contains elements very similar to the Robin Hood tales. So while there's no definitive proof that Robin Hood was a real person, there's actually no proof that he wasn't. However, the legend likely has roots in the lives of real outlaws, the folk heroes from medieval England. The stories of Robin Hood have been shaped by centuries of storytelling that kind of ended in the 1980s and 1990s. And I think what they do is they blend historical events, local folklore, and literary invention into the iconic figure that we know and we love today. Is he real? He could be. All right, thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.